Good morning. Good to see everybody. I know we have quite a few out traveling. I know we've got quite a few out sick. So be careful. Be safe. Be clean. Last week we started a little 4-week series we're calling Grace-Filled Giving. And last week we looked at an example of that kind of giving. And I just want to preface again before we get into this. The best time to talk about giving is when giving isn't a problem, and for us it hasn't been a problem. But I want you to hear what God has to say about it moving forward, because it's a tremendous blessing in your life to give as God has showed us and has given us an example. So last week we looked at the example. This week I kind of want to swap a little bit. We're going to talk about an exhortation, all right? Of grace-filled giving. We're going to stay in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. Actually, we're going to stay there for the duration of the series, all the way for the next couple of weeks. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, these two chapters are rich in the teaching of Christian giving. They teach us so much about how we are to use the resources that God has entrusted to us for blessing His kingdom and for blessing His church. Properly understanding and applying this teaching can have a profound effect on your life and on how you give and the blessing that comes from it. Now, I know, and I've said it, and some of you right now are wishing that you'd scheduled that long-lost visit to Aunt Agnes, or wondering why your dentist doesn't schedule root canals on Sundays, because you're thinking that would be much less painless than another sermon on giving. But the reality is, we talked about this last week, Jesus talked a lot about money. Jesus talked a lot about wealth and what our response to it is. And we kind of set the tone last week by saying our attitude towards money is kind of a litmus test of where our heart is. It's kind of a barometer as to how our heart is in tune with God. And so we're gonna jump back into this. Just by way of setting the context again, Paul in 2 Corinthians, he planted the Corinth church in around 51, 52 AD on his second missionary journey. Paul's now raising money for the church in Jerusalem because they're experiencing some tremendous financial difficulty. They have had this big influx of Christians that have come in, lack of jobs, persecution as a result of being a Jew, and a massive famine. All are impacting Jerusalem heavily. So Paul, everywhere he's going, is asking for help for the saints in Jerusalem. So he's been up to Macedonia and he's asked them for money, and we talked about them last week. He's down at Corinth asking the church there to support the work. But actually, he had already asked the church at Corinth to support the work about a year earlier. So now he's repeating that request. There was so much poverty and so much persecution that the churches up in Macedonia were probably the poorest of all the Gentile churches. And yet, consequently, as we saw last week, they're probably the best example of what grace-filled giving looks like, giving out of their even poverty. But today I want us to notice this exhortation and kind of come at it from the attitude of what does a grace-filled giver look like? What attitudes do we need to possess in order to give in a grace-filled way? And the first thing I want us to see is simply that grace-filled givers give graciously. Okay? Graciously. You understand what that word means. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We'll read 6 through 9 first. He says, accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this grace, in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. You know, Jesus is always the preeminent example in everything in our life. He's the example of service. He's the example of suffering. He's also the example of sacrifice. Like Jesus, the Macedonian church gave themselves, as we talked last week, first to the Lord. And if we give ourselves to God, then we have little problem giving our money to God. Again, it's that litmus test. It's that condition of our heart. If we give ourselves to God, we'll also have no trouble giving to others who are in need when we see them, when we come upon them. You know, it's impossible to love God and ignore the needs of our neighbor. Jesus gave himself for us. Galatians 1:4, Galatians 2:20 tells us this. Should we not then give ourselves to him in return? He died so that we might not live for ourselves, but for him and for others. The Macedonian giving was motivated by that grace we saw last week. But in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul uses 9 different words for this offering that he's collecting. But the one he uses the most is grace. He uses grace more than any other word to describe the giving and the offering that he's there to collect. Don't forget, the Macedonians were extremely poor, and the Corinthians were relatively rich. So he's talking to two diverse, economically situated communities. But it is quite a rebuke to the church at Corinth, who were so enriched with spiritual blessings. We see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. That was the issue. They've got so many spiritual gifts in the church, they're fighting over them. Okay? Yet, they neglected the grace of giving that is also a gift of the Spirit. The Macedonians, on the other hand, had an abundance of poverty, extreme poverty, yet they abounded in the grace of giving, in generosity. These Corinthians had an abundance of spiritual gifts, but they were slow to keeping their promise, slow to fulfilling their pledge of what they had said they would do. And we can never argue that the ministry of our spiritual gifts is a substitute for generous giving. Let me say that again. Okay? We can't argue that our spiritual gifts are a substitute for generous giving. In other words, the thought process goes, well, I teach Bible class, so I give in that way, therefore I don't have to give monetarily. Okay? Or I give my time, therefore I don't have to give my money. Folks, that's not an explanation, that's just an excuse. Okay? And I'm not saying it, Paul does. Okay? The Christian who remembers that his gifts, his spiritual gifts are gifts, and are motivated to give to others because of that, and they don't hide behind their ministry for the Lord. I met Christians who've argued that, well, they devote their time and effort and energy. They're not obligated to give. But Paul argued again, just the opposite. Since you are wonderfully gifted spiritually, you ought to want to give more, even financially, is his take. That's what Paul's saying. And Paul, don't miss me here. Paul was careful that they understood he's not giving them a command. He's not commanding them to give. That would have been so easy. Paul could have said, I command every Christian on the first day of the week to set aside 10% of whatever he's earned after taxes, devoid of your retirement plan. He could have laid out that formula, couldn't he? And most of us would have thought, well, that's probably easier. At least we'd know, right? But he doesn't. Matter of fact, he's contrasting the attitude of the Macedonians with that of the Corinthians. He's pointing out that the Macedonians were following the example of the Lord. They were poor, yet they gave. Now, these Corinthians said they loved Paul. Now he's asking them to prove that love by sharing in this giving, this offering for Jerusalem. Grace-filled giving is an evidence of love because it's given graciously. Love for Christ, love for those who have special needs that we are able then to help. Notice also that Paul points out that Jesus, our example, who was rich and became poor. We don't think about this too often. But in what ways was Jesus rich? Well, he was certainly rich in person. He was eternal God before he left the throne. He was rich in possessions and in position. As King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he owned it all. He had power over it all. He was rich in power, for he could do anything he wanted. Yet in spite of all of that, all that he had, all of the riches that he had, he became poor. And the tense of that verb in that verse indicates that in his incarnation, his birth at Bethlehem, is when that took place. He united himself to mankind and took himself a human body. He left his throne to become a servant, and he laid aside everything he had, all his possessions, so that he did not even have a place to lay his head, he would say. I have nothing. Not even a place to lay my head if you're going to follow me. His ultimate experience of poverty was when he was made sin for us on the cross. Hell, in one sense, is eternal poverty. And on the cross, Jesus became the poorest of the poor. But why? Why did he become poor? That we might become rich. I'm not talking dollars and cents. like rich and spiritual blessings that he pours out upon us. Matter of fact, Romans 8:17 refers to us as those who are heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. That's the place I want to be. So if this is true and we believe this, if we believe we are heirs of God and joint heirs of Christ, how can we refuse then to give to others? Can we not follow his example as the Macedonians did, who out of their extreme poverty abounded in graciousness and generosity? When you give, how do you give? Is it graciously? Do you see it as an act of grace on your part? Do you feel warmth in your heart because of the graciousness? Because you're allowed the opportunity to, as Herb talked about this morning, to give back to God, to show God how much we love him by what we give. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it. Which leads right into the next one. Grace-filled givers give willingly. Okay? I told you we wanted to answer some questions. Here's another one. How should I give? Okay? Is there a tithe? We'll get to that in a minute. 8:10 through 12. He says this, he goes on, and in this matter, he's still talking about this giving, in this matter I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish it. Finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. It's an important principle. There's a great difference between a promise and a performance. Okay? Great difference between a promise and a performance. I had a friend in last week from Oklahoma. And he's one of my best, he's probably one of my best friends in the world. He's a preacher in Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. Some of you might have met him Wednesday night. Anyway, he and his wife came down, spent a couple of days with us, and he was my golfing buddy. We played golf every week together, and so we went out one day and played golf. But the night before, he wakes up, he comes down to breakfast, and he looks at me, he goes, "Man, I had a dream." And I said, "You had a dream?" He goes, "Yeah." He said, "I'm going to shoot 65 today." I'm like, "What?" Now, for those of you non-golfers, okay, that's really good. That's really, really good. I mean, par 72, 80's good. 65's unheard of, at least in the recreational golf world. He said, "I don't know if it was an omen. I don't know what it was, but I had a dream. I was looking at my scorecard. It said 65. Of course, my first response is, "What'd you do on the back nine?" Okay, but nonetheless, he had this picture in his mind. He had, boy, that's what I want. And we go play golf. Well, he didn't shoot 65. Not even close. Okay, but there's a difference between a willingness to perform and performance, and we can't confuse our willingness with our doing. Okay. The Corinthians had boasted to Titus a year before that they would share in this collection. Oh, a year ago they were willing to help, but guess what? Paul's back a year later saying, time to put up or shut up. You said 12 months ago you're going to help. I haven't seen anything yet. Okay? Here he emphasized willingness. It's got to come from a willing heart. It's not forced. It's not coerced. Okay? But willing and doing have to go together. If the willing is sincere and in the will of God, then there also must be a performance also. We see this in all areas of life. We see it in all areas of Christianity. Oh yeah, I hear what the Bible, I'm willing to read the Bible. Great, I'm glad you're willing to read it. Are you willing to do what it says now? See, doing and willing go together. But understand, God sees the heart gift, not the hand gift. If the heart wanted to give more, but the hand doesn't, what does that look like? Warren Wiersbe tells a story of a friend of his who was leaving on a business trip. And his wife reminded him that before church that she needed some extra money for some household expenses while they were gone. This is back before everybody had a card, right? Dad and I have been trying to use cash lately, and man, it's really weird because people just don't know what to do with it. You hand them money, and they look at it like, "What is that?" Like, it's cash. We used to use this all the time. Promise. It's still good. Still good. But anyway, his wife needed some extra cash around the house. He was going to be gone, so they're sitting in church, and the husband pulls out a wad of money, and he hands it to his wife. Well, she's thinking because the offering plate's going around, she's supposed to throw it in the offering plate. So as the offering plate goes by, she dumps it all in the deal. And then afterwards, they're eating lunch. He goes, okay, what'd you do with that money I gave you for the household expenses for the week? He's like, whoops, I put that in the collection plate. So he comes to Wiersbe and says, well, I kind of had this thing, and Wiersbe says, well, he finally comes around and says, well, we gave it to the Lord anyway. He keeps record, right? They kind of wrote it off as, well, it went to a good cause anyway. But Wiersbe came back with this. He says, well, how much did you intend to give? And he gave him the amount. He says, well, chances are that's the amount God recorded, the amount you intended to give, not the amount you gave. Because God saw the intent of your heart. You see, God sees the portion, He doesn't see the portion, He sees the proportion. Again, we go back to the widow's mite. How much did she give? She gave all. Forget that it was 2 mites. It was the proportion that mattered. Okay? God sees the portion, not the proportion. Other way around. If we could have given more and don't, I think God sees that. If we wanted to give more and couldn't, I think God also knows that as well. When we give willingly and graciously according to what we have, we are practicing grace-filled giving. Ask yourself that. When you give, do you give willingly? Or is it under some compulsion, some fear? Some fear, if I don't, I'm going to get in trouble. You know what's been eliminated by our online giving and all the different options we have? Guilt. Some of you know what I'm talking about. When the plates were passed, right? And I know now our little ones love putting money back in the plates, and that's a great thing, okay? Used to, though, when the plates were passed, and that was the only way to give, you could get guilted really easy into giving, because that plate, you got that guy standing there on the end of the deal, and he's got that plate, and he hands it to you, and you got nothing to put in it, and you're just kind of going, next person, right? We had a guy growing up. We got them here too, the little metal aluminum plates. And he was a construction worker. He had big hands. And every time the plate would come by, he'd hold it, and he'd take his thumb, and he'd thump the bottom of it, and all the change would rattle, and everybody thought he was putting money in, and he wasn't. He just sounded like he was. He kind of had that down to a art. The one day he did it too hard, and money went flying to the row behind him. They kind of figured it out. But, we've taken the guilt, the visual guilt out of our giving by giving. Oh, well, because now you can assume, well, they gave online, or they put it in a box back there. But my point is it from your heart? Is it gracious? Is it willingly that you're giving? Not out of coercion, not out of guilt. And the last thing I want to look at simply this morning is grace-filled givers give proportionally. Look at verse 13 and 15. We'll start closing this down. He says, I don't mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Paul here is not suggesting that the rich become poor so that the poor might become rich. That would be silly. Okay? It's silly for a Christian to go into debt in order to relieve somebody else's debt. Okay, unless you can make sure you're going to pay all that back. Paul saw a fairness in this whole procedure. He's saying the Gentiles were enriched spiritually by the Jews, so the Jews should be enriched materially by the Gentiles. Go read Romans 15. You want to see how this works out. Okay? He's saying here, because it could change. Further, the Gentile churches at that time were enjoying some measure of material wealth. There was not an issue in Corinth in that area of them being wealthy. There's a big issue down south in Jerusalem, but what he's saying is, listen, you don't know in the future if that doesn't swap. There may come a time when you need help and Jerusalem's doing good and they may be now helping you. Okay? But here's the thing. Who does the equalizing? Who does the fairness? God does. God does. Paul uses this miracle of the manna in the wilderness as an example, as an illustration of what's going on. No matter how much manna the Jews gathered each day, they always had what they needed. They always had what they needed. And when they got too much, What happened? If they tried to save it for the next day, it would decay and mold and turn into something that stunk really bad. So he was teaching them a lesson. I will take care of you. I will meet your daily needs, but don't go beyond that. The lesson to me is clear. Gather what you need, share what you can. Don't try to hoard God's blessings. Share them. That's what God's given them to you for in the first place. Okay? God will see to it that you will not be in need if you trust Him and if you obey His word. We had this conversation with Dan and Carol the other night. Dan's been in ministry for, a long time, 40 years or so. And he made the statement, in all of my time in ministry, I have never seen one of God's children go hungry or go in need. Why? Because God takes care of us. Okay? He does. Our motive for giving is for God's glory, but our measure for giving is God's blessing on us. Paul made this clear when he wrote 1 Corinthians in that letter, 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Paul didn't lay down any mathematical formula. So for those of you that were waiting for that magical formula of how much should I give? Is it 10%? Is it 9%? Is it 50%? Is it 75%? Okay, there is no magical formula. There is no percentage. Okay? None. Because grace-filled giving is not limited by a tithe, limited by a 10%. Because here's the deal. If you're making $100,000 a week, okay? That's a lot of money, right? A lot of money. Let me ask you, 10% of $100,000 is what? 10,000? How much does that leave you? 90,000? I think I can make it a week on that. How about y'all? Make it a week on that? Yeah, I think so. Is that a sacrifice? If I'm making $100,000 a week, is $10,000 a sacrifice? What if I make it $100 a week? Is $10 a sacrifice? It very well may be. You see what I'm saying? That's why these systematic formulas don't work. Okay? And that's why here in 16:2 he says, give how? Not give to 10%, but give as you may be prospered. Give as God has blessed you. Grace-filled giving, yeah, it is systematic, but it is not legalistic. God wants you to give from the heart. Okay? And since it's God who does the balancing of the books, we can't accuse Paul. Some have accused Paul of being a communist or a socialist, right? I mean, seriously, that thought is out there. It's prevalent. And matter of fact, it's actually pitched as one of the tenets of Christianity. We're creating a socialistic or a communistic society. They actually use Acts chapter 2. They had all things in common. And they quickly want to run to socialism or communism and say, oh, well, churches are just another form of communism. That's the furthest thing from the truth. There is not a tenet one of socialism or communism anywhere in Christianity. Okay? And let me just tell you one reason why. It's all by choice. In socialism and communism, you're not asked if you'd like to share. You're made to share. You're made to be equal. But in Christianity, the idea of sharing is a blessing to you, and it should be done graciously. It should be done willingly. It should be done proportionately to how God has blessed you. This is not a give or else. As Herb said, we're testing the love in our heart for our God. And it really boils down to this. Grace-filled giving is simply a matter of faith, because we obey God and believe that He will meet our needs as we help to meet the needs of others. As the Jews gathered the manna each day, so we must depend on God to, as Jesus said, give us this day our daily bread. But we don't waste and we don't squander what God gives us, neither do we hoard it. In the will of God, it is right to save. I mean, the Jews on Friday saved manna because they couldn't gather it on Saturday. It was the only day when they gathered the manna that it didn't go bad. So they gathered for enough for the next day. Saving is not a bad thing, okay? Don't misunderstand me, okay? Saving within God's will is not a bad thing. But out of God's will, when we hoard wealth, it will harm us. Go back and read all of James chapter 5, that part of our scripture reading was taken from today. And it's up to you in your heart to decide, am I hoarding it or not? Or am I sharing it or not? Amy Carmichael was a missionary to India. She once said this, you can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. Just think about that, okay? And understand, our giving, when we do give, and I know because it's on, we've got the opportunity online now, and we've got boxes, and we still pass plates, and we don't make a big deal out of it because that's between you and God, okay? But I pray you see it for the blessing that it is. I see that you wrap yourself around it and test God in this. One of the things that Malachi also says is to test him in this. See if he doesn't throw open the store gates of heaven itself. Probably the only thing God asks us to test him in is in giving. Have you tested him, or has he tested your heart? Today, are you giving graciously? Are you giving willingly? Are you giving proportionately? And if that doesn't describe your giving, maybe you need to take a hard look at your heart before you take a hard look at your finances. What are your intentions? Jesus became poor not only to teach us about giving, but also he came leaving heaven to save your soul. Taking money off the table for a minute, you need to understand, if you're not in a relationship with Jesus Christ this morning, you are desperately poor. As a matter of fact, spiritually, you are in extreme poverty if you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And Jesus sacrificed everything he had, power, position, everything, to come to this earth, to live a perfect life, to die on the cross, to save you from your sins and to save me from mine, in order that I might become rich, that I become a joint heir with him, that I can live eternally in heaven with him, that I can enjoy the blessings of life on earth in a relationship with him. The blessings go on and on and on. And today, if you're ready to commit your life to him, we got water, we'll baptize you, we'll start you right on that journey today. We'd love for that. But maybe today you just need prayer from this congregation for your heart to change. Maybe your money's become your idol. Maybe it's what guides you. Maybe it's what motivates you. Maybe it's what controls you. And maybe you need the prayers of this congregation to help you get back on track. Whatever you need today, we invite you to come and let us know as we stand and as we sing.